Good afternoon, everyone. Can I get confirmation that everybody can hear me all right?
What's up?
Great, fantastic. Hi, everyone, and welcome. My name is Alex Theakston Musselman. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm an assistant teaching professor in engineering and mathematics, and I'm also a member of the Equity Across the Curriculum Initiative, EAC for short, which is the group that's sponsoring today's event. I have the pleasure of introducing today's speaker, Dr. Dorinda Carter-Andrews. Dr. Carter-Andrews is a professor and chairperson of the Department of Teacher Education at Michigan State University, which is actually my alma mater. She teaches courses on urban education, critical multiculturalism, and critical race theory. She holds many degrees, a Bachelor of Industrial Engineering from Georgia Tech, a master's in education from Vanderbilt, and master's and doctoral degrees in education from Harvard. Her research is broadly focused on Black education and racial equity and justice in the pre-K through college learning environments. She utilizes critical race and Black feminist, womanist frameworks and methodologies to examine issues of race, culture, and power in schools. She is currently the principal investigator for a grant that explores racial equity in school discipline for Black students. She also works with school districts, universities, municipalities, corporations, and civic organizations on how to develop and maintain culturally responsive, inclusive, and equitable learning and work environments. She's a bit of a polymath. She's a formal industrial engineer, high school math teacher, kindergarten teacher, and has teaching experience in lots of different settings: suburban, urban, charter, and independent schools. In terms of my personal connection to Dr. Carter-Andrews, I had the pleasure of being her graduate student in her critical race theory course. And she also serves as an invaluable member of my dissertation committee. Since its formation in 2020, just a couple of years ago, the EAC initiative was envisioned as a peer-to-peer model to grow anti-racist and liberatory pedagogies in classrooms and across the curriculum. So therefore, when we were attempting to understand how white supremacy culture exists in the classroom and to reflect on the ways we as faculty and staff either perpetuate or resist it, we sought the expertise of Dr. Carter-Andrews for all the aforementioned reasons. So I am so pleased to have her here today to guide us as we grapple with these difficult conversations on our campus and in our community. In this session, Dr. Carter-Andrews will talk for about 45 minutes. After that time, we will invite you to type any questions that you may have in the chat, and any remaining time will be spent addressing those questions or comments. So as she's talking, please jot down any questions that you might have that arise as Dr. Carter-Andrews is speaking. So welcome. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Alex. I'm so appreciative of that introduction, and good afternoon to you all. It's early evening where I am, and so I just am appreciative to you for showing up for this hour together and to just be in community with me as I share some of my insights with you and really just challenge you to continue digging deeper in the work, thinking differently about your own work and about yourself too. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get right into it. You saw that the topic for this hour is disrupting whiteness and white supremacist logics and actions in college classrooms. And that's a hefty topic, right? Like that's a whole bunch of stuff that requires more than 60 minutes. And so I hope that I will just be able to drop some nuggets for you that will, inspire you to dig deeper, as I said, and continue doing the hard work, because that's really what we all need to be doing. So I'm going to go ahead and move along. As a good educator does, I always have too many slides and I'll watch my time and see how we go. But I do want to thank Alex. It's just a pleasure when your former students and now colleagues invite you back to wherever they are to be in community with them. So I'm thankful to Alex and to her colleagues who are advancing this work at UW-Bothell. So I think it's important to start with how I show up to the work and to do the work. And you will find out why this is important to do. Alex gave you a little bit about me, but I think it's important to also note that I'm a Black, cisgendered, able-bodied, heterosexual, Protestant Christian, economically advantaged, standard English speaking, sometimes woman. I'm also the daughter to parents who grew up in the Jim Crow South. I'm a mother, practitioner, scholar, activist, and those hyphens mean something, and I always start with mother. I'm a second generation college student and yet the first person in my family to obtain a doctoral degree. I draw inspiration from Black intellectual and spiritual ancestors and elder leaders and community leaders. And lastly, as you heard Alex say, I draw upon Black feminist, womanist, also critical race and intersectional frameworks. Those shape my epistemological and ontological orientations as a scholar. And, you know, some of you will know these big terms, others won't, and I will break them down as we go along. Whiteness is at work in higher education, right? Some of you may not know that nearly 75% of full-time faculty in the academy are white. But whiteness isn't just about white people. And that's what we're here in part to talk about today, right? I don't know who my audience is on screen. I can't see all 75 of you. I'm gonna assume it's a predominantly white audience, and I want to challenge the audience members to not see this as individual discourse, right? But how do we think about whiteness as something other than white identity? Because it is at work in higher education. So while we start with white folks who predominantly populate the faculty, I would argue that all of us, it's incumbent upon all of us to disrupt and dismantle both whiteness and white supremacy. And I'll say more about that in the classroom. I think it's important whenever you're having these conversations to go over terms. We all enter the conversation with different knowledges, different lived experiences, different vantage points. And there are 4 terms here that I just want to define from my time with you, right? And share with you where I'm coming from. The first is culture. When I think about culture, when I talk about culture, when I write about it and teach about it, I'm using a certain definition. I think that's important for you as faculty and budding faculty members or other types of educators to be clear about your terminology. For me, culture is a shared, learned, symbolic system of values, traditions, social and political relationships, and worldviews that shape and influence our perception, our behaviors, and our interaction patterns in the world. That's important for you as a faculty member, as an educator. Why? Because you bring culture to the classroom. You don't just meet culture when you get there. Secondly, culture is created and shared and transformed by a group of people who are bound together in certain ways. It could be common history, geographic location, language, social class, etc. Right? When I introduced myself to you, it's important for you to know that I am a daughter of parents of the Jim Crow South. That means my understanding of race, culture, and power is contextualized by my upbringing in the South, by parents who grew up in a segregated South. And that's important for even how I teach in the college classroom. Thirdly, culture is created and recreated in the context of our everyday lives. It's dynamic, it's not static, and it's context specific. You're creating, you have a culture in your classroom this semester or quarter. It won't be the same culture in the next class, right? You create it and recreate it with the students that you're interacting with in that context. And so, one thing we have to understand fundamentally when we begin to talk about disrupting whiteness and dismantling white supremacist ideals and logics is that culture is dynamic. So, the form, the manifestation that whiteness takes is not static. And that's really important for us as educators who teach different groups of students all the time. As I said, culture is context specific. What's normative in one environment is not normative in another. And there are subcultures within cultures, which is why we can't essentialize, right? But whiteness requires essentialization. Sit with that for a minute. So if you're trying to dismantle whiteness in your pedagogy and practice, you can't essentialize students. There are subcultures within cultures. Women as a cultural group, but there are subcultures under the umbrella of women. Christians as a cultural group, but then there are different denominations under that umbrella. I think you get what I'm saying here. And lastly, culture is not synonymous with race. Race is often coded as cultural difference, but I want you to move away from saying culture when you mean a racial or ethnic group. Say what you mean and mean what you say. You can't disrupt whiteness when you are conflating terms. And we often use culture as a code word for other things that are elephants in the room. Okay. So I start there with culture. I hope you have a better understanding. It's important to start there as we then define whiteness. And this is a long definition, but I love this article from Matthias and Boucher and how they define whiteness here, drawing on other scholars in the field, right? Whiteness is socially constructed, but it continues to structure the overall organization of society. I want you to think about that because whiteness continues to structure the overall organization of the academy in which we teach. Thus, we are socialized into whiteness as a cultural norm. Zeus Leonardo talks about this. And then Vieska and all say it's a social construction that embraces white culture, ideology, racialization, expressions. It goes on, epistemologies, emotions, and behaviors. I want you to capture those key words to think about when you are in a classroom setting, the ways in which you respond to students' varied expressions, lived experiences, ways of knowing and being. And we'll talk about that again in a minute. Whiteness reaps real material benefits. And as Cheryl Harris says, some of you all might be familiar with her work, Whiteness as Property. I don't have time to go into that, but even obtaining a college degree is codified as a property function of whiteness. So how do we disrupt that, right? How do we disrupt that property function? Getting a college degree is access to a whole set of public and private privileges that materially and permanently guarantee basic subsistence needs and therefore survival. Our work as faculty is critical, not just to the liberation of students, but to some students' very survival. And when we uphold systems that oppress unintentionally, we begin to tamper with students' survival. I want you to think about that. The last thing here, George Lipset says, is what it means to be white represents this embodied politics in which one actively invests to reap these material, institutional, and societal benefits. So that leaves me, and oftentimes at the expense of people of color. Matthias and Boucher go on to say, whiteness, while widely reduced down to normality and privilege, is a system. I want you all to be thinking about your pedagogy and practice in the college classroom as systematic. What you do is systematic. You take up certain ideologies, cultural beliefs, and practices, and they structurally manifest, even if you're not thinking about them like that. And so the question becomes, are you perpetuating dominant ideologies, cultural beliefs, and structures that oppress or affirm and lift up, right? And so we'll talk about what that can look like when you're doing the oppressing unintentionally. So a question for you is, what is the overt and hidden curriculum for investing in whiteness in academia? For us as faculty, there are benefits to upholding those cultural codes. They help us, but they might systematically disadvantage students. So I want you to be thinking about, how do your colleagues uphold the expectations for this investment? And what are the repercussions for students of color and other marginalized students? Okay. What are some of these cultural codes of whiteness? If whiteness is this system, you're saying, Dorinda, what do you mean it's a system? It's a culture, it's socially constructed. Well, whiteness defines goodness. It defines smartness. It defines professionalism in higher education and truth, big T, right? And so without perhaps even knowing it, right, our ideas of goodness, smartness, professionalism, what counts as truth and knowledge, gets transferred in the classroom as we pick what we teach, how we decide to teach it, the types of assignments we give, how we construct groups, all of that, I would argue, and research shows, is cloaked in cultural codes of whiteness. So let's talk more about that. I want you to think about this. Follow me with this. If we were together, I'd have you fill out some paper around this. Well, whiteness and white supremacy, I hadn't forgotten about that. We're going to get to it, are part of or make up systems of privilege and power. And we as faculty manifest those systems in the classroom. Now, this is very US centric, but you can think about it in a global way as it's relevant to who you're teaching and who you are. So if you look on the left side of your screen, there are certain societal dominant groups in the US by race, class, gender, sexuality, religion, ability, and language, right? And by dominant, I don't mean majority in number, I mean decision-making power. Now we're starting to get into these cultural features of whiteness. Follow me. By race in the US, whites are dominant in terms of decision-making power. By class, it's upper class people. By gender, it's men, and I would say cisgendered men, right? Men who align with typical masculine codes. By sexuality, it's heterosexuals. By religion, it's Christians. Some people often wonder, is it Protestants or Catholics? It's actually Protestants in the US. By ability, it's able-bodied people. By language, it's native English speakers. I want you to think about these identity markers as then having cultural codes. Remember, we started by talking about culture and who gets to define the codes and set the standard in each group, right? Men set the standards for what it means to be masculine. Cisgendered men do, right? And thus, when they, because they have power, they perpetuate patriarchy, which then oppresses women and those who don't identify as cisgendered men. Where am I going with this? That the isms that you see on the right, we often perpetuate in ways we don't even recognize in the classroom. How did I make an instructional move that was ableist or linguicist, right? Or heterosexist or homophobic, right? Or racist. And the cultural codes that are dominant in these categories were defined by members of the group who get to define the cultural codes. So ultimately, colleges and universities act or operate, as you see down here at the bottom, under these dominant cultural codes. So they are inherently racist, sexist, homophobic, ableist, ... And thus, as educators, we have to be sure that we are not perpetuating those isms, those systems of oppression. Those systems, many would argue, sociologists, other critical scholars, are foundationally rooted in understandings of whiteness. So when you're trying to dismantle, disrupt whiteness, you have to think about other knowledge systems. And here is where I begin to break down those big terms like epistemology and ontology. These are questions I want you to be asking yourself about students. Students come to your class with diverse ways of being, ways of knowing, right? Their epistemological orientation may very well be different from yours. I started out by saying I am a Black, cisgender, woman. I show up to class with a certain orientation. I show up to class with a certain lived experience. And I ought to be open to affirming and integrating the epistemologies and ontologies and axiologies that my students show up with, right? So if you don't have a sense of how your students come to know what they know, how do they exist in the world? What do they value? How do they define what is good, true, right, and beautiful? Then I would encourage you to find out about those things, because we often learn one knowledge system in higher education, and that's a Eurocentric knowledge system rooted in whiteness as a cultural norm. And that can be damaging and toxic for both us as educators, but definitely for our students. So this framework here, I don't mean to go into that, but I wanted to use this table to show you components of knowledge systems that I believe we need to be thinking about if we are moving to disrupt whiteness in college classrooms. Then we have to be open to diverse knowledge systems. And that's going to take some learning from each of us. That being knowledge systems of students from tribal communities and other racial and ethnic communities. So now that we've defined culture and whiteness, we understand, and we've looked at those systems of power and privilege. What happens in the classroom is that faculty and students have got to work through cultural differences. Faculty brings certain norms, values, beliefs, expectations, ways of knowing and ways of being and interacting to the classroom, but then so do your students. And somewhere in the middle, biases, stereotypes, and assumptions are embedded, right? And they impact how we make decisions about instruction and how we make decisions about faculty-student relationships. So I would encourage you to look at this Venn diagram not only as what's the onus on me, but to understand students also come with certain epistemologies, ontologies, et cetera, that are rooted in their proximity or not to whiteness, because we are all socialized under that cultural norm. So there could be a lot of alignment between you and students in a certain semester or quarter, and in another semester or quarter, there could be a lot of cultural clash, right? Based on these pieces. So whiteness determines faculty pedagogy and practice, whether we like it or not, how students show up in a classroom, right? And by show up, I mean how they enter. Do they feel like your classroom space is a welcoming space? Can they be their authentic selves in that classroom for the time they're with you? How students are positioned in the class, meaning how you position them. What knowledge gets valued in the classroom? Whiteness also determines acceptable forms of assessment, right? I want you to keep thinking about that clashing. So I may have constructed certain forms of assessment for my course, but are they so limited, so aligned with the heteronormative Eurocentric model that students who have creative, expansive ways of communicating their learning can't do that? That's something you have to ask yourself, right? Am I not expansive enough in allowing some different types of demonstrations of one's learning? Whiteness even determines acceptable forms of classroom engagement and participation. Does participation only mean I've got to speak in large groups? Can I participate, virtually, one-on-one, right? What are those acceptable forms and who gets to decide? And whiteness determines who is perceived as smart and intelligent. Now, I want you to look at these 7 again to think about, when I say whiteness, we're talking about this system of dominant cultural codes that all of us can be colluding in and not meaning to, right? So you have to step back and do some self-examination. Although I've been doing critical work for over 20 years, I'm constantly having to stretch myself, especially now with Gen Z learners. If any of you know research on Gen Z learners, our pedagogy and practice have to change in ways that really require us to disrupt whiteness in the college classroom, because they come to us differently. Research shows they're much more social justice oriented. They're going to question you a bit more. They're going to call you to the carpet. And so you've got to be ready and thinking in ways that are a bit more critical and conscious of issues of culture and power, right? And how they're manifesting in the classroom. So I suggested this as a pre-reading, and I thought it was a great piece, although it's not specifically about classroom instruction. But if we're going to be committed to dismantling whiteness, Vidal-Ortiz gives us some thoughts around this. We have to name it, denounce how it works, when it does, and through whom, and make evident the patterns that may be obvious to some and not to others. So we'll talk in a minute about some of those instructional moves where you're like, oh, I didn't realize that might be a damaging move, and it's upholding whiteness as opposed to dismantling it. Dismantling whiteness in academia is about giving up power and privilege and recognizing that for many students, y'all, university spaces are hostile. They are, right? For faculty, staff, and students of color. And I love that Vidal Ortiz says we have to rage about diversity, right? We should be so outraged that we want to advance diversity. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time trying to define white supremacy, but remember, I told you there were 3 terms we were going to define: culture, whiteness, and white supremacy. And I know you all have been talking about white supremacy culture, so you've got some sense of whiteness as this cultural norm. But white supremacy, people get all nervous and think about, the KKK and the extremists. It's not just, that's the extreme. It's this greater set of ideas tied to white racial, political, economic, and cultural dominance. And it's a grand sense of entitlement. That seems so simple to me. And for me, it's a great way to understand white supremacy as logics and ideals. And whiteness upholds those logics and ideals. And as a faculty member, you've got to think about, man, am I participating in the white supremacist project without even knowing it? Am I holding up those political, economic, and cultural dominance ideas? And if you go back to that table I showed you, those dominant markers around race, class, gender, sexuality, ability, and language and religion all utilize dominant codes that assume whites as superior. Thus, in your classroom, you have to be working against white supremacist logics. So what does she mean by logics, right? Examples of white supremacist logics, those expectations for participation and engagement. I want you to think about, what are my expectations for how students participate and engage? Are those written in the syllabus, and do I need to revisit them? Are they too restrictive, right? Are they narrow-minded? Here's another example of white supremacist logic. What counts as knowledge? You're teaching a class. Where do the readings come from? Do they only represent one type of perspective, or are all the authors white? You mean to, I don't care what subject it is, you mean to tell me there's no scholarship written by people of color that you can include into your content? That's bull, right? You're upholding white supremacist logics around what counts as knowledge if you can't diversify the content of your curriculum. Again, types of assignments, and then watch this, an individualistic orientation, that should say, to teaching and learning versus a collectivist orientation. Is everything in your class about the individual advancing? Are all assessments based on individual learning? Some learners come from cultural backgrounds that are very much collectivist. You don't have any kind of partner assignments or group projects. That's holding up white supremacist logics, because white supremacy says individuals are superior, right? So again, these small moves that you may not be thinking about, but you're perpetuating. Here are some problematic assumptions that perpetuate whiteness and uphold white supremacist logics. We often make assumptions about students' learning behaviors and capacities. Watch this. We'll assume they'll seek help when they're struggling with the class. We just assume they'll take the initiative, right? Like, all students don't do that. So what measures do you have in place in your course that open up a door where it's not all about, well, they didn't come to see me, they didn't reach out. We also assume students from certain groups are not intellectual, or they're irresponsible, or they're okay with below average grades. See, you may not be saying it out loud, but it's an implicit bias that you have. So I want you to be thinking about, how am I acting on something like that? That's holding up white supremacist logics. We also may be assuming students from certain backgrounds, whether it's urban, rural, or they speak with an accent, or they're from specific racial or ethnic groups. Oh, they're poor writers. They're never gonna get it, right? That's one of those conscious moves, right? And that poor writing suggests limited intellectual ability. We cannot connect writing skills with intellectual capacity, okay? We may have some assumptions about older students or differently able students. Oh, they're slower learners, they require more attention. How do you know that? Don't make these kind of problematic assumptions. Or if they are not native English speakers, right? Students whose cultural affiliation is tied to non-English speaking groups are not native English speakers. How do you know that? They may be bilingual or multilingual. These are problematic assumptions. I have two more. Students who are affiliated with a particular group are experts on issues related to the group. And you assume that they want to be the native informant in your class to speak on behalf of their group. That's a problematic assumption. It upholds essentializing, and it's toxic for minoritized and marginalized students. And lastly, we assume students from a particular group, racial, ethnic, gender, sexuality, whatever, share the same view on an issue. And their perspective will necessarily be different from the majority of the class who are not from their group. These are research-based findings, y'all, that faculty often assume. And these are the kinds of moves in the psyche, but also behaviorally, that uphold whiteness and white supremacist logics. See, it's small things that we have to begin to move away from. And what they require is for you to look at your lenses. It's about positionality, your own race, ethnicity, language, class, age, right? Remember, I shared when we started some aspects of how I show up. I want to ask you, how do you show up to class? And how do you humanize yourself to your students so that that allows an entree for them to be more fully human in your classroom? Whiteness would say that we divorce ourselves from a more humanistic relationship in the classroom. And when we don't examine our own positionality and lenses, we are more likely to aggress students in the classroom. These are the three most common micro and macroaggressions: racial, gender, and undermining the intelligence and competence of students, even when we don't mean to do that, right? So that introspective work around your proximity to whiteness and the cultural codes of whiteness and your proximity to holding up white supremacist logics, you've got to examine that so that you know where you need to disrupt and dismantle in your own pedagogy and practice. I'm getting close to the end here, but I want to share some examples from STEM classroom climate experiences. This was from some research that I can certainly provide the references for, but particularly for students of color in some STEM classes. Faculty These are moves, low expectations and marginalization, tokenism, native informant, right? That assuming they can speak for their whole group. These double standards around their academic ability, and just general lack of respect from others in the academic community. And what are the ways in which some faculty isolate students of color in STEM from cultural community and even academic communities? So I don't want to reduce disrupting whiteness to inclusive teaching. I don't want to do that because I think it's bigger than that. But I do think the research on inclusive teaching gives us ways forward. So I wanted to name that, but then share this with you. Inclusive teaching in higher ed refers to the ways in which pedagogy, curricula, and assessment are designed and delivered to engage students in learning that is meaningful, relevant, and accessible. If you are perpetuating whiteness and white supremacist logics, your teaching and learning is not going to be meaningful, relevant, and accessible to all. It's just not. Inclusive teaching practices reject deficit mindsets. They reject those problematic assumptions that I shared with you all, right? You won't say stuff like, oh, they're lazy and they don't want to work hard, or they don't have the skills to make it here. You may have heard some of your colleagues say that. Who would say that about a student, right? That's a deficit mindset, right? But we speak those things sometimes. So how do we create inclusive college classrooms? There's specific things, the course content, we talked about that. You have to be aware of your assumptions and potential multicultural issues that might arise in your classroom. You have got to get to know your students in whatever way you do that. I do a pre-survey before each semester to tell me a little bit about my students before day one. Your planning of the class sessions, are you using different modalities and pedagogical strategies, or do you always only lecture? Right? Like that it's not inclusive, and it upholds those old school norms of like, I teach, you learn. What model is that, right? So you've got to get to know your students and your knowledge about diverse backgrounds and behaviors during the process of teaching. So I love this little piece by Sean Harper and his colleague, Charles Davis, that gives us 8 actions to reduce by racism in the classroom. And I see these as helpful in dismantling whiteness and white supremacy in the college classroom. And you can find this article online. It's a quick read. You have to recognize your own implicit biases. You can't dismantle whiteness or even disrupt it if you don't check, excavate your own biases and remediate your racial illiteracy. You might be saying, well, what is racial literacy? It's that expansive piece around learning about various groups. They say, don't be surprised when a student of color is a good writer, right? Like, just don't be surprised about that. Or don't be surprised when they're a good scientist or, mathematician or historian. Stop expecting students of color to speak for their racial ethnic group. We don't all have the same lived experiences. Stop holding essentialist assumptions about students of color lived experiences and capabilities, right? These are like basic things. Be aware that stereotype threat may be occurring with some of your students of color. And for those of you who aren't familiar with that, stereotype threat is when a student of a minoritized identity assumes that they will perform according to the stereotypes about their group. And so thus, when they actually perform in your classroom, they underperform according to their ability. Faculty have to counter that by starting class with praise and affirmation. I know everyone in this class can do this work. I know, there are triggers, there's research about this around ways to combat stereotype threat. That, y'all, is a specific move to dismantle whiteness and white supremacist logics. Meaningfully integrate diverse cultures and people into the curriculum. Listen, what I don't want you to do is add a reading from a scholar of color to the syllabus and you don't really know how to teach the reading. That can be more damaging because then you're going to be fumbling and mumbling over it when the students try to have discussion with you. Increase your literacy first and then add the readings, or add them and have someone come in, right? As you are growing in your ability to do anti-racist, anti-oppressive work, draw on others to help in your classroom. You don't have to be the end all be all for the work, right? I know my lane of expertise. Therefore, if the topic in my class is LGBTQIA2S plus for the week, I'm going to bring someone in. I'm not sidestepping, but I'm still learning and don't feel comfortable trying to facilitate the dialogue on my own. Listen, don't turn the other cheek when you see racial tensions arise in the classroom. You've got to address it. Your students are looking to you to be the model. And recognize that you and your faculty colleagues share so much responsibility for racial inequities, institutional, structural, and environmental, right? 8 simple things. I kind of tweaked them a little bit to say some things I wanted them to say, but they're close to what Sean and his colleagues said. Lastly, I want to leave you with a couple of questions, and I don't know why it's putting them out of order. I want you to be thinking about, I talked about those big words, epistemology and ontology. What can I do differently to advance epistemic, ontologic, racial, ethnic, and cultural diversity in the classroom, right? What can you be doing differently? What dominant cultural norms exist in my pedagogy and practice that need disrupting? Like some of you just need to take some time, get you a critical friends group and talk about number 2, right? Have somebody come observe your class. Number 3, how am I creating a classroom climate where diverse perspectives and identities are affirmed, included, and expanded? I want you to know I learned, I left out affirmed here, but I learned this piece around expansion from one of my CRT students this semester, that it's not enough to just affirm and include. How are we helping students expand and grow their identities, right? And fourthly, how am I decentering whiteness in my teaching by centering marginalized and minoritized voices and experiences? If you're not committed to doing something different by way of number 4 and 1, you're going to continue to uphold white supremacist logics, ideals, and whiteness and its cultural norms. And lastly, I would not be, sufficient if I didn't have you turn that mirror on yourself. What work am I doing to excavate my own positionality and its relationship to my pedagogy and practice. So with that, I'm gonna skip that and go to questions because we have just a little bit of time. Thank you. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Richie, are you able to enable the chat, please?
Yeah, hopefully everyone should be able to add to the chat now.
Fantastic. Great. So yes, Dr. Carter Andrews is welcoming your questions. If you'd like to write a question or a comment in the chat, I will be monitoring that and facilitating that conversation. So. Don't be shy.
Please don't. Yes, I will. Yes, Christine, I will make sure that Alex gets the questions on the last slide so that those can continue to percolate for you and move you forward. No questions? Oh. STEM leadership. How can division chairs? You know, this is a great question because I'm a department chair, right? I think you can start this question around how can division chairs lead their faculty in these conversations. I think you can start a study group around a text. We've done that in our department, you know, inviting folks in around a particular book that deals with these topics. And then we're able to talk across. We've done lunch and learn around these topics. And so you can do it over the course of the semester, the year. But again, it's the invitation to be in community with others, right? Obviously, mandating doesn't work, but certainly that kind of invitation into some kind of continuous reading or lunch and learn type group. The other thing I've done is, as a department chair, is drawn on my leadership team and my program directors, because I want the work to get into curriculum and clinical experiences. And so if I can get my program leaders on board, now we can begin, they can, in other meeting spaces, if I've got a vision, how do we grow the vision across the unit? So those are some strategies. How do you see grading scales and admissions playing into the white logics? Yeah, I mean, this is a good one. We have, so in our department for the doctoral program, we got rid of, you know, we had to see if it was okay with the university, but we have stopped using SAT scores as something that we look at. I mean, you know, check these things. If it's not a university requirement and you all have a commitment to do something different, stop doing it, right? Like, I mean, you know, so we're trying to do things that are humanizing, radical. We trust ourselves to be able to assess quality in admissions. So if we don't have to use gatekeeping measures, we want to throw them out, right? So these are things you have to be thinking about. How are we upholding the logic structurally or through policies in a department or a program or a course sequence? Do you have suggestions of alternative ways to assess student participation?
And Dorinda, I'm so sorry, I wanted to interrupt because
Yeah.
I am getting direct messages too. So yeah,
sorry.
so no, I it's great. If you could go ahead and answer the question that you just started on, and then I'll come back to one that actually preceded it in my chat. If we can do that, that'd be great.
Okay, thanks. Yes, suggestions for alternative ways to assess. You know, I do a lot of, I mean, people do, you know, oral projects. And presentation of those projects, you don't always have to be testing. Obviously, it depends on the nature of your content, right? I don't think tests are bad. If tests are the only way you assess, I think that's what's bad. So allowing students to do oral presentations, creative writing. I've had to expand myself around, okay, when you write a research paper, it only can look this way. No, I've expanded my thinking. Some students epistemically might want to include some poetry, right? But as long as they make the connections and the citations that I need, I'm okay if the way that you kind of express that lit review doesn't necessarily look like I've always seen them. So we talk through alternative forms of assessment. Go ahead, Alex.
So our next question comes from Alex B, and I think he just actually had his hand raised. Alex, did you still want to ask your question?
Yes, I'm sorry, I'm finishing my cookie. Yes, so first of all, thank you, Dorinda, for this great talk. And it wasn't a question, I just wanted to say how important, at least from my studying of philosophy that I've been doing, the question of epistemology and knowledge. And I think that as long as we see knowledge in a consequentialist kind of way, we'll treat how the student will tolerate what they do in order to achieve what we want them to achieve, as opposed to assessing really the doing instead of the end product. So I was just really excited when you mentioned epistemology. That's all.
Thanks for that. The great comment that you just made. I hope others take that away. I agree with you.
Oh, great, thanks.
And our next comment / question comes from Warren, and he asks, or just indicates that it's a wonderful presentation and that there's a lot of valuable information here. Have you published this information? And if so, can you provide us with some references, perhaps?
So I would say I haven't published this talk in this way, but I do have some work on decentering whiteness, particularly in teacher education. So if you go to Google Scholar or just look for me, you'll find it. You can find my work in Google Scholar. I also have many of my articles on academia.edu, and you can download the PDFs.
And I think after that comment is when it picks up back in the chat. So I'm happy to continue to name them for you if you'd like, whatever your preference is. So Alejandro was the next comment or question in the chat.
Oh, I see. How best to address the issue of students not reaching out when they struggle? I personally reach out to them. Yeah, this is difficult. So, and I don't teach large lecture classrooms. And so for those of you who teach, large lecture style classes, it is hard sometimes to know who are the students who are kind of falling through the cracks and need that one-on-one relationship with me. I do think those are the classes where surveying, having some time stamps, maybe mid-semester, but they can't be anonymous because you need to know who's saying what. Let the students know that. Be very transparent about why you're collecting some data, because you want to open up the door for someone to be able for you to connect with someone who might need that connection. I think transparency is so important, but it is harder in larger classes. Obviously, people have office hours. Students don't do that all the time. Are there ways that you might use some social media mechanisms, right? Again, how do you attend to the modes of communication that Gen Z learners use? They don't use the typical modes that some of us may be used to who have been teaching for a long time. I do give students my cell phone number. Some of them use it, even undergrads, some don't, but I know that this is a texting generation And I'd rather them text me than to not reach out at all, you know? So again, think about who your learners are. Alex, do we have time for maybe one or two more?
If you have the time.
Okay, let me just
We'd love to
see
hear
here.
more, but
Let
if
me
people do need
just
to leave, they'll
see
leave on their
after
own.
Alex.
I think
Thank you
Martha
so much.
Groom's question was next, if you do have time to answer it.
Okay, absolutely fine. Nature. Okay, so Martha is saying she has seen head on some racial tensions and other identity-based tensions among students in the classroom. Those can be tough, and some are less obvious, and she finds those harder to surface or address. You know, the ones that are less obvious, I like to do a check-in with the student one-on-one. Not in person after class. I might send them an email. I watch body language a lot. And so I will send a student an email. Hey, just want to make sure class went okay for you today. You know, you just look, your energy looked a little different. I'll say something like that. Again, I'm trying to open the door for them to respond to me. If somebody said something that was assaultive, I can't let it go. So I will email that student after class, because see, your other students are watching. They will not forget, and they want to know, how is my professor going to handle that and model for us what intervention looks like. So I will, I'll immediately reach out to that student who made the comment. I also want to reach out, maybe it was in the broader air, maybe it was to someone else, but again, reach out to that student immediately. You've got to chat with them, and then you've got to think through, is there a way when I come back next week or next meeting time that I need to address it to the whole class? Sometimes you don't need to address it to the whole class, but sometimes you do. But always address these issues with the perpetrator and those who have been victimized. If you feel like you can't facilitate those conversations on your own, that's when you write to a unit chair or a program director or whomever in your office is the person that could help with this. Your associate dean for equity and inclusion or what have you. But don't let it slide. I'll take one more.
Brenda, I'm sorry to jump in, but there was just a question that slipped through the cracks earlier, and I see it might be related to another question in the chat.
Okay.
Would you mind if I just read it out loud?
Please.
Okay, so this comes from faculty member Susan McNabb, who writes, I've always been concerned that students arrive at university feeling labeled by past experiences, especially in STEM fields. I was excited to see that you have worked at all different levels of education. Do you have any specific advice to help those students? And I also just thought it was related to a question that one of our academic advisors, Annie Gordon, put in the chat as well, about supporting students who are trying to get into very competitive majors. Of course, our STEM majors tend to be the more space constrained ones. And Annie writes that I find the competitiveness of higher education so intertwined with whiteness. I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, it is. This is where, thank you for lifting those up. This is where we have to have institutional supports, right? Where are the, particularly for students who come to the university space with perceived labels in K-12 or wherever they came from, they need affinity group spaces that provide, that are identity affirming. I have some writing on what I call identity affirming counter spaces. Those spaces need to affirm identity and also provide academic support, right? And if you can't do one and the same, it's incumbent upon the university or the college or the department to ensure that the academic support piece is somewhere else. Where's the tutoring? You know, how do we make those measures available for students who traditionally and historically come with perceived labels, right? The competitiveness of certain majors, I think we have to have policy levers that allow equal access to the same types of opportunities. We can't just rely on students to kind of acquire the skills they need to get into those competitive majors. So this is where structural and institutional interventions disrupt whiteness as a cultural norm, right? That's not on individual faculty members. That's where faculty have to say, look, provost, we need to do, the narrative is let's diversify this particular major. Well, we have to put mechanisms in place to help the pipeline become diversified. So I would push on the institution in those ways around. This is what we've done at MSU, right? Faculty push. And we try to get upper administration to respond to those structural barriers that are operating as gatekeeping mechanisms. Okay, Alex. I wish I could stay longer.
I know. No, we thank you so much for your time and your insight. This is such a valuable conversation. So thank you for taking time to speak with us. I will keep a hold of the chat, and if there's any nuggets in there that I can pass on to Dr. Carter Andrews, I'd be happy to do that. Thank you so much for being here today, and thank you for all who attended.
Yes, thank you for having me, and I will send you that email later tonight with the questions.
Fantastic.
Have a good afternoon and evening, you all.
Thanks all.